Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to CLS Social Studies. Today we're going to be talking about reform movements during the time of the second wave of immigration, the mid-1800s. So reform was an important priority for many Americans during the time of industrialization in the United States. Urban Americans were suffering on a daily basis. Injuries or death was a daily occurrence at the factories. Overcrowding, filth, and disease were prevalent in everyday lives. So reform movements were bound to happen. And what did most Americans turn to when they were down on their luck? Religion. Members of the new emerging class, especially women, were at the forefront of the reform movements. They would tackle issues like alcohol abuse, prison and education reform, and slavery. From the very first settlers that immigrated to the New World, the escape of British rule and the creation of a new land free from religious persecution, religion has been at the heart of the American way. Americans used religion as a basis for many opportunities in the governmental experimentations of the United States. On January 16, 1786, the Virginia General Assembly passed Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. The statute is a statement about both freedom and conscience and the principle of the separation of church and state, and is the forerunner of the First Amendment protections for religious freedom. Religion started as the backbone of the American experiment and continued to be for centuries that followed. Religious reform took on many faces during the period of industrialization. In the Second Great Awakening, it was a Christian renewal movement that started during the 1790s and early 1800s and started the Great Reform push through the revival of religion and beliefs. Evangelists believed that it was going to be the churches that made the societal changes, not political movements or violence. Charles Grandison Finney was a former lawyer that dropped his law firm to become an evangelical leader. Finney fomented spiritual revivals that swept through the villages of upstate New York and later spread to New England and in the South. Church memberships increased significantly during the Second Great Awakening, while small fellowships of worshipers became larger gatherings with the goal of the common good for all. Millions across America had a renewed religious faith, as many believe that each person is responsible for their own salvation and people should prove their faith by doing good works in the community. Even though Finney's reform ideas angered such strict Presbyterian clergymen like Lyman Beecher from Boston, hopes were high that religion would cure social disorders in America caused by rapid expansion, population growth, and industrialization. So let's cover some education reform. During the era of industrialization, fallacies in the education system became very visible. There were very few teachers who were properly trained to educate students properly, and schoolhouses were very small. Most schoolhouses only had one room that would need to accommodate all of the students. Another problem with the education system was that the quality of the education given was primarily based on wealth and social standing. For this reason, many poor merchants in the North and a vast majority of poor farmers in the South did not have a primary focus on education for their children. Education reformers like Horace Mann believed strongly in public education and that all children should be taught in the same place. Mann spearheaded the common school movement. He believed that all children, regardless of wealth or social status, should be taught in a common place and have available better schools offered a quality education. Mann became the first Secretary of Education for Massachusetts and convinced the state to double the state budget, raise teacher salaries, lengthen the school year, and begin the first school for teacher training. Education reform provided new opportunities for women in the United States. Catherine Beecher, daughter of Presbyterian and clergyman and reformer Lyman Beecher, vehemently fought for female education and the incorporation of kindergarten into the school system. Women's colleges began to open in 1821, and in 1823, Beecher opened the Hartford Female Seminary in Hartford, Connecticut, where she was a teacher for many years. Education reform also helped people with special needs. Thomas Gallaudet opened a school for the hearing impaired in 1817 and became its first principal, and a school for the blind opened in 1831. Another reform movement that we had was temperance, and a prominent problem that occurred during urbanization and industrialization was alcohol abuse. Many men who worked long days in the factories and lived miserable lives and filthy lives turned to the consumption of alcohol to ease their pains. Beer and liquor became the heal-all during the 19th century. Women would spearhead the temperance movement. The temperance movement was a social movement against the consumption of alcoholic beverages, specifically hard liquor. Many Americans believe that alcohol abuse caused family violence, poverty, and criminal behavior. There was validity to this argument. Men would drink heavily and go home after a long day of drinking and sometimes hit their wives or children. They would spend what little they earned on liquor and turn to theft to bring home any funds they could. The temperance message spread throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century with the help of the American Temperance Society and the American Temperance Union. Some women held up signs that said, "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours." This was how serious women were about men not drinking liquor. Another reform movement that we're going to cover was prison reform. So what was a prison? Until the 19th century, if a juvenile was in trouble with the law, they were passed to the custody of their parents. The mentally ill and orphans were placed into the prison system. After the War of 1812, reformers began to fight to remove children from jails and into juvenile detention centers. But what was the prison system? Was it a place for penance or for punishment? To some, it was the latter. In 1821, at Auburn Prison, some 80 prisoners went crazy and committed suicide because of the harshness of solitary confinement being thrusted upon to them. Reformers knew that something had to be done to protect the children and the mentally ill, and to make the prison a place for discipline and place where prisoners can be reformed. Dorothea Dix once said that the sick and insane were confined to this commonwealth in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, and pens, chained, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. She would go on to attain evidence of the wrongful treatment of prisoners and the mentally ill. Dix served as a superintendent of army nurses during the Civil War, and she was an American who advocated on behalf of the mentally ill. Through a vigorous program of lobbying state legislatures and the U.S. Congress, Dorothea Dix created the first generation of mental asylums in the United States. Urbanization bred crime, and criminals needed a place to stay to pay for their penalties. Prisons in the United States were horrible places where unheard of barbarity had been placed upon prisoners. The meanest of men were placed in prisons with children and the mentally ill. Reformers like Dorothea Dix led to movements to reform the prison system. Some of her goals were to build prison libraries, to incorporate basic literacy for Bible reading, a reduction of whipping and beating, a communication of sentences, and a separation of women, children, and the sick. She worked to remove the mentally ill, the runaway children, and orphans from prisons where they were treated poorly. In addition to the problems that were occurring in asylums, prisons were filled to capacity with everyone who committed crimes like murder all the way down to spitting on the street being placed in the same facility. Men, women, and children were thrown together in the most barbaric conditions. What could Dorothea Dix and reformers persuade the government to do? Governments responded positively to prison reformers and began the long process of prison reform, a process that is still considered incomplete today. Mental hospitals were built to house the mentally ill. Reform schools were built to help reform misguided children, and houses of correction were built that provided education for inmates in the correctional system. The United States began to have some of the best prison systems in the world and became a model for prison reform, including how society became responsible for criminal activity and had the duty to rehabilitate alcoholics and protect neglected children. The last type of reform that we're going to cover is civil rights. So with other reform movements seeing successes, other groups of people wanted reform in the way that they were being treated as well. The 19th century saw reform attempts for the better treatment of free African Americans in the North and reform and abolition of slaves in the South. The free African Americans usually lived in segregated or separate communities in the North and did not have the opportunity for an education, and in the South the institution of slavery ruled and African Americans had no rights at all. In the North, free African American religious society was founded by a former slave named Richard Allen, which became a model for other groups that worked for racial equality and education for Black Americans. Many influential African Americans pushed for the creation of schools for Black Americans, and in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, opened elementary schools for African American children, and a few colleges would accept African American adults. As for the South, laws like the slave codes barred enslaved people from receiving any type of education at all. So you can see during this time of reform in the urbanization and industrialization of the North, lots of people are starting to fight for their rights, and they are starting to win them. So we're going to go on and keep on with this urbanization theme in the next section. Have a good one. I'll see you later.